and welcome to Upfront. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Kang Cheri. Securing free trade agreements has now become a central part of Korea's trade policy, starting with the Korea-Chile Free Trade Agreement going into effect back in 2004. Korea has inked deals with major economic partners such as the U.S., the EU, and China, just to name a couple. On today's Upfront, we assess the past, present, and future of Korea's trade policy, and I am very much honored to announce today's great panel of experts. First, we are joined by Chairman Han Duck-soo of the Korea International Trade Association, who is also a former finance minister and prime minister of Korea. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to see you.
And Professor Park Tae-ho of Seoul National University, who is a former trade minister at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Welcome to our program.
Good to see you.
And of course, Mr. Lee Jung-soo, co-president of Sustainable Development Global Network. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right, so it's like I said, it's a great honor to bring the two of you in the studio because you guys are the renowned experts of Korea's trade policy. And I just mentioned the Korea-Chile Free Trade Agreement that took effect back in 2004. But what is your favorite? Which particular free trade agreement do you give the most meaning to? Anybody?
Free trade agreements is very, very comprehensive agreements between and among particular countries. So they are destined to have not to have only limited meanings of economic importance. It's clearly non-economic things that are attached to this kind of agreement. So when we say free trade agreements, it's a more comprehensive and more integrated concept of relations between and among countries. In that sense, I think it's clear that Korea-US FTA should get top priority in terms of its comprehensiveness, in terms of its sophistication, and in terms of its meanings for our bilateral non-economic relations between Korea and US. And in terms of economics and non-economic aspects, Korea-EU FTA is also very important in terms of also the comprehensiveness and sophistication of the agreements. Korea-China is also very meaningful for us because China is the number 2 largest economy globally, and China has a lot of meanings and significance in Northeast Asia.
I'm not different from Chairman Han's opinion, but I want to emphasize a little bit more on Korea-US FTA because when we start this kind of idea in 2005, immediately other countries, it triggered other countries' interest in having FTAs, such as EU and even China show its interest after we start talking to United States. In that context, I think Korea-US FTA is the starting point of our grand strategy. Right. And maybe Korea-China FTA is kind of closing not closing completely, but our first round of strategy can be closed by Korea-China FTA. In that context, I think Korea-US and Korea-China is very important.
The last significant FTA Korea had was with China, and it really made headlines in domestic as well as overseas media. Do you think this Korean-China FTA made other countries to pay more attention to Korea's trade policy?
Definitely, especially the FTA with such a big economy as China clearly has various implications for the countries outside the China and Korea. First of all, if other countries invest in Korea, they can use Korea as a hub or a springboard for going into China. So Chinese market is indirectly give some of the meaningful locations for receiving trade and investments from outside, except Korea. So it's very important.
If you look at Korea-China FTA, simply speaking, China is number 1 largest trading nation in the world.
Right.
How about Korea, number 9?
Yes.
So ninth and first largest trading nation have FTA.
Right.
No matter how the content may be,
Yeah.
it is big news.
Yeah, right.
If you look at only East Asia, number 1 and number 3 countries are having FTA. So I think it has a lot of attention. It draws a lot of attention from many countries.
But in terms of significance, it's clear that if United States, EU, and Japan can join in Korea-China FTA, the significance will be greater. So we should always pay very close attention to how many countries are involved in any kind of FTA.
So all these great points that we are going to actually delve into and dig a little deeper. But before we do that on this topic, let's first take a look at the history of Korea's free trade initiative, the transformation of Korea's FTA policy, and the country's expansion of its economic reach in the global economy.
An FTA is a trade pact that liberalizes the trade of supplies and services to promote free trade between nations. It especially focuses on the removal of tariffs on imported goods for trade liberalization. Free trade offers businesses chances to advance into overseas markets without high tariffs and also lets consumers buy imported goods at cheaper prices. International trade is expected to expand in accordance with the growing exchange of materials and human resources. Korea, a trade power nation, has been very active in signing FTAs, from its first with Chile in 2004 to the one with Australia that went into effect in December. Korea has 10 free trade pacts now in force. Korea is the only nation that has settled FTAs with the US, EU, and China. It is also active in multilateral trade negotiations, a new trend in global trade, including the Korea-China-Japan FTA and the RCEP. All eyes are now on the expected impact of the multilateral trade pacts on Korea's economic recession.
All right, so as we just saw in the video, Korea now has free trade agreements with pretty much all the world's major economic powers, and that's not an over-exaggeration. And first question, maybe Chairman Han, do you think Korea is making use of its free trade agreements strategically and managing to boost its economic competitiveness using these free trade agreements?
Of course, the top priority for having this kind of FTA concluded is that it may broaden your base for competition and the markets. So with a greater competition, definitely it'll be good for you for lifting your level of competitiveness.
So we have the Korea-Australia FTA taking effect in December, and another one with Canada taking effect in January, and we have other ones with New Zealand and Vietnam, China waiting for the legislative approval. So looking ahead, what's your future outlook of Korea's free trade initiative from here on, maybe starting in 2015?
I think you mentioned a couple of them already, but the Korea-China FTA,
Right.
we just completed substantially. That means we didn't really finalize the whole agreement. And our agreement with New Zealand or Vietnam recently concluded. So we have to say that each country has its own domestic process to start implementation. So for the case of Korea, we have to go through the ratification process at the National Assembly. I don't know about our partner countries. Maybe they have their own internal processes. So maybe in 2015, we can see Korea-China FTA really starting to implement it. So that's the kind of immediate future. But as Chairman Han says, maybe in the future, we have to participate more larger so-called mega RTAs like RCEP or TPP, but we have to wait and see what happens.
But it's clear that in theory, if Korea can conclude FTAs with all the countries in the world. Actually, that is the real free trade agreements at WTO level through Korea. So if people invest in Korea, then they can export their goods duty-free to all the countries in the world. So Korea will continue to develop the new markets through this FTA approach when WTO level of negotiations are still dormant. So we should next go to Latin America and also to Middle Eastern countries. And possibly Russia may be one of the candidates for us, although Russian situation is a little bit different.
But within academic discussions, having more and more FTA bilaterally, that's why it's important to join the larger mega RTA where many countries are participating at the same time, because if you add more and more bilateral FTA, the marginal benefit is not that great, but managing separate FTAs in terms of customs and administration will be rising. So I think at a certain point of time, we try to integrate individual bilateral FTAs into bigger ones. I think this is the discussion some academics are doing now.
Certainly the trend, right?
What if a country, let's say Korea, made a bilateral FTA with, let's say, one country, one of the ASEAN country. Then later on, the Korea make the regional the package as ASEAN, as the economic package, make FTA with them. Then how is the bilateral FTA stand at that point?
For example, we have ASEAN, Korea-ASEAN FTA,
All right.
but we are having separate FTA with Vietnam.
Right.
How do we deal with
Right.
this? It also depends on provision. Normally, you can choose either one in favor of your own position. In other words, Korea-Vietnam FTA has higher level of liberalization. We want to take that route. And in certain aspect, Korea-ASEAN has a very favorable route. We can take that route. So we can choose. So businessmen, it's okay. But if you have too many bilaterals, businessmen are confused.
Right.
Yeah.
And the
Right.
people at the National Assembly have more work to do in that case. And you mentioned the WTO level of liberalization, and certainly it's a global body overlooking global trade affairs. Now, free trade pacts have emerged as one of the hottest topics in the field of the global economy. And recently there was a conference that was dedicated to solely discussing the future of Korea's trade policy, and which Chairman Han and Professor Park will also participated in as well. Now, in this next video, we are meeting another participant from the WTO to get his take on Korea's trade policy. Here is Mr. Yonov Aga from the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Take a look.
I think Korea has done well based on what has come out of its recent trade policy reviews in the WTO. Since the advent of the Asian financial crisis, the government has been restructuring in terms of reforming both its financial and corporate sectors. From the point of view of the WTO, whether members engage in bilateral, plurilateral, or the so-called now mega regional RTAs, these are all compatible and consistent with WTO rules, not minding the fact that we would still prefer members to try to find solutions to their needs under multilateral trade rules. And this is notwithstanding the fact that there is a limit to what you can get in bilateral or regional trade agreements.
All right, so that was Mr. Aga, Deputy Director General of the WTO. So from here on, I want to talk about some of the challenges ahead for Korea's trade policy. And maybe the first question to get us started with that topic would be, When Korea promotes its free trade agreements, it's to mainly boost exports. Do you agree?
Well, exports, imports, overseas investments, and investments that are coming inward.
So to create that virtuous cycle, I guess. And do you think free trade agreements that Korea has been pursuing or has pursued has successfully helped small and mid-sized companies here in Korea to boost their competitiveness? Not only the big names, but the small ones.
Exactly, because well, in this globalized world, and at this level of sophistication of our industry, there is no products which can be manufactured or produced by only one big company. Impossible. So, for example, automobiles has more than 20,000 parts and components. When these finally assembled products are going abroad, definitely it has an impact on small and medium-sized companies here. The question is whether how these small and medium-sized companies can benefit from this increased trade and investments. It's clear that when there are some difficult trading procedures like high tariffs and all that kind of things, the first target for inconveniences of this kind of complicated procedures are small and medium-sized companies.
Right.
So for the small and medium-sized companies, although they may be affected adversely through elimination of tariff and simplified of the procedures and so on, it's small and medium-sized companies who are benefiting most. Big companies can maneuver and overcome all the difficulties that are coming from very high tariff, almost prohibitive tariff before the FTA.
What about you, Professor Park? Do
Well,
you think we're...
let me address a little bit different aspect of the FTA's impact on small and medium-sized companies. I think this is a good opportunity for them to participate in global trade through this kind of favorable conditions. However, if you want to utilize big FTA like Korea-US and Korea-EU, you have to prepare a lot of documents, so-called origin documents, in English and foreign languages. So I think small and medium-sized companies may feel that as a burden. Unlike big companies, they have separate offices who can specialize in preparing these documents. So in that context, I think the utilization ratio by small and medium-sized companies are smaller, relatively smaller than large companies.
We have headquarters for helping small and medium-sized companies in preparing themselves for utilizing this kind of FTA. And there are 16 regional offices across the country to help these small and medium-sized companies. And the utilization ratio is increasing rapidly. For example, for big companies, it increased in 2012 from 74% to 84% in 2013. For small companies, it increased from 59% to 69%. So 69, 84, there are some margins. But what I'm saying is that, of course, our Korean International Trade Association are helping them, and the governments are helping them.
So there are certainly efforts like that to create that virtuous cycle, taking advantage of free trade agreements. Now, let's take a look at this next report to find out the impact of FTAs on domestic businesses.
Korea's trade volume has surpassed $1 trillion for 4 straight years. The milestones have been reached despite a global economic recession. The government says increased exports to countries that have signed and settled FTAs with Korea was the driving force behind the trade surplus. Those countries include advanced nations like the US, along with those in the EU and ASEAN. The Korea-US FTA has been in effect since 2012, and Korea's total exports to the US have seen the greatest rise compared to other regions. Of all the areas of trade among 4 countries, including China, the auto and manufacturing sectors have enjoyed the greatest rises. The government has positively reviewed Korea's FTAs, with the nation's economic territory making up over 80% of the global economy. But there is concern that the impact of the FTA is not being felt by the public in their everyday lives.
In the case of kiwis imported from Australia, I don't feel like they are any cheaper.
The media keeps mentioning the economic effects of the FTA, but I don't see the impact, even at major supermarkets. Fruits like bananas are imported, but I don't feel like they're any less expensive.
Once a country enters into a free trade pact, it is normal for the prices of goods to decrease along with the tariff elimination. But the problem is, there are still a lot of goods that this basic rule does not apply to. Agricultural products like oranges and beef are two examples. The reason consumer prices don't decrease is that exporting countries impose higher prices on the goods, and the distributors who are from oligopoly markets increase their profit margins. Small and medium-sized businesses also haven't felt the real effects of the FTA. As every country has different rules of origin and customs procedures, it is difficult for them to actually benefit from the settlement of the FTA. So 6 out of 10 small and medium-sized businesses have complained about difficulties in making use of free trade agreements. In order to help the public actually feel the positive economic impact of the trade surplus caused by FTAs, now is the time to re-examine the policies for the distribution system and tariffs.
All right, so as pointed out in this video report, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing Korea's free trade agreement or trade policy? What are the lessons learned from the past experience, do you think?
Some predictions of damage because of liberalized trade, has not been realized.
Okay.
We were very, very, anxious about the import of grapes from Chile when it was ratified in 2004. But a lot of systems were put in place. We give some kind of cash grants for closing in the agricultural farmings and things like that. But they were not used very much, I should say.
You mean the scope of the
Right.
government support?
Right.
Okay.
So that means the competition through this FTA were not so much damaging to Korea, even in presumably weak sectors. So that is one lesson. The second one is that the impact on prices are not so big as was just reported in the video. When you feel some impacts, the previous price should be high, or the tariff should be high. So beef has a very high tariff, and automobiles have a very high price. So with FTAs, the price of automobiles were down, and the beef prices were down. So with the reduced price for cars, the share of cars out of our domestic demands increased from 8% to 14% now, which is pretty large. But in beef area, our domestic farmers are really good at adjusting themselves. So still they are keeping around 50% of their shares, while the remaining 50 were taken over by several competitors, the countries which have FTAs with us. So the impacts of our FTAs were not even. They were rather uneven, I should say. Although we can feel them, they were felt for some limited items. So, the beauty of FTA means we have more competition. So domestically, we should have a really competitive, institutions and structure so that our impacts of FTA are really keenly felt.
Chairman Han and also video mentioned that through FTA, consumers don't feel much benefits. Some areas we can see some price going down, but generally speaking, they don't feel that way. They mentioned already distribution services. Our distribution sector is more monopolistic.
Right.
If you look at the so-called wine importation, we have a separate groups who are only importing wine, and then these importers only can sell to wholesalers.
Right.
Wholesalers can only sell to retailers. There are many different layers. If you go through each layer, they put more premiums. So even though we lower the price at the border,
Sure.
during the process of border to consumers, we have a lot of inefficiencies. So that's the one challenge we have to do through deregulations, many other things. But one last thing I want to mention is with our partners, Korea, EU, Korea, US, big FTAs, we don't have that problem. But we have FTAs with Peru, Colombia, Turkey, and even the in the future FTA with Vietnam. The bilateral trade is already, we have an excessive surplus. In other words, we're exporting very much. We are not importing from them. So if you look at the other countries' perspective, we have an FTA with Korea, and they cannot export anything, but they are importing more. So I think for that kind of countries, that's the thing I want to so-called manage or enhance communication with our trading partners, and even share our experiences how to utilize FTA.
As I hear, the FTA is a real animal that impacting our trade a lot. But why is that a lot of people who are not familiar with this subject, and what is the reason, and how can you tackle this problem?
It's clear that there will be always some views of dissenting against this kind of liberalization, and they have one or two reasons for that. But we should continue to communicate with them, and we should show them of the results. And also, lastly, we should do something for the areas and for the sectors and for the people who are left behind because of this more severe competitions with the outside world.
Actually, that was the key question students keep asking me why in international trade course. Think about simply this way. We have about 50 million people in Korea.
Yeah.
Each person has their own preferences.
Right.
But somebody looking at the buying cars, maybe they feel like I got benefit from FTA. But somebody who are not caring about the car, they don't know anything about it.
Right.
So if you add all the benefits 50 million people will be huge benefits. But if you divide that by 50 million people per person, they don't feel great. I mean, they don't feel very important. If you add them together, it's big. But on the other hand, the losses, the farmers and the fishery people and agricultural people, if they lose some smaller kind of amount compared to the benefits, but these losers directly affecting you. So their voices are very, very high. So in other words, per person benefit out of FTA is small. On the other hand, per person losses, they feel within the industry is huge. That kind of asymmetric kind of situation make the so-called anti-FTA voices make louder than supporters.
So what would be the best way to bring their support or somehow make sure the local agricultural sector is not hit too hard with the free trade agreements if we decide to open up the agricultural sector? And my concern is that government subsidies cannot cure all. It cannot be sustained long term. So what do we do? Any ideas?
But at the same time, we should think that it's not only trade who are affecting agricultural farming. The technology development actually affects our agriculture very much, and the social, impacts of rapid aging in the rural area are also affecting our agricultural farming. So the way we should go ahead is clear, that we should make our rural area more competitive. Not only agricultural farming, but rural area as a whole. We should try to make our agricultural sector more competitive by mechanizing the farmings and introducing more technology into that area and creating more jobs in the rural areas except agricultural farming. And at the same time, our agricultural farming should go overseas in accordance with our FTA. We should go to China, we should go to United States, and there are some farmers who are doing their how do we call it, horticulture of flowers in Florida. And they are supplying all across the United States. And we can rent some lands in China and maybe produce some rice and import them into Korea again.
Let me add, in these agricultural issues, let me add one thing, because if you go back to our history, we have already experience of helping or giving compensation to the farmers or agricultural sector for more than 20 years, from early 1990s. After Uruguay round, after Korea-Chile FTA, after Korea-US FTA, we add many compensation packages. So I think it's time for us means maybe government or research organization, to evaluate the results of our compensation scheme.
How effective they are.
Yeah, and so Chairman Han says we set aside the funding for closing the fruit farming. Nobody actually claimed that they closed their farming area. So we have to record everything. We have to make a very transparent and objective paper so that not only agricultural people but also consumers can share this kind of experience. In other words, we want to make a compensation scheme more smarter and future-oriented.
Sure.
I think this is time for Korea can do that.
Yes, in search of a long-term strategy to help out the agriculture sector and boost the effectiveness of free trade agreements. And at this point, I want to get a perspective from outside of this studio. Our Upfront team had a chance to meet Alejandro Jara, the then chief negotiator of the Chile side for the Korea-Chile Free Trade Agreement. Note that Chile is the first country that Korea signed a free trade agreement with, and it's been a decade since the implementation. Take a look at this next interview.
I think that the agreement that Korea first negotiated with Chile is a very good example of a very successful story of two economies which are geographically far away, but that go very close into integration, and to show a very good numbers in terms of increase of the levels of trade. And I think that this agreement can lead and should lead to increase in levels of investment between the two in the coming years, and hopefully that the industries becomes more closely associated in terms of becoming partners in producing goods and services for other markets as well. So it's the beginning, and it's certainly a very good basis on which to pursue further economic opportunities and to create wealth and employment on both sides. Agriculture is protected, like fisheries in many countries. It's politically and socially controversial. To liberalize trade means that they will be less protected, but it doesn't mean that they cannot be supported. It's just a question of changing the instruments by way the farmers or the fishermen are assisted. They can be provided with other means of support and assistance that distorts trade much less.
The dynamics of global trade have shifted from bilateral free trade agreements to multilateral pacts. Along with the globalization of the economy, an increasing number of neighboring countries have cooperated to build an economic community that is mutually beneficial to one another. The European Union, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and APEC are examples of regional economic cooperation. Asia has faced strong competition in building up an economic bloc, which has been the recent global trend.
The US and China have gone through fierce competition to take a leading role in Asia. That includes competition between the Trans-Pacific Partnership led by the US and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is led by China. If and when all 12 nations participating in the TPP negotiations sign an agreement, it would create the world's largest free trade zone, with about 40% of the global economy accounted for. To counter, China has focused on uniting Asian economies with RCEP. Two competing multilateral free trade blocs led by the US and China, the G2 nations have put a lot of efforts into getting Korea to join. Korea has been put into a difficult position between the RCEP led by China and the TPP led by the United States.
Now, I want to talk about the bigger picture of things and perhaps add the political factor into this conversation. So, for instance, take the Korea-China Free Trade Agreement. After we signed that deal, a lot of people were talking about assessing potential impact on the Seoul-Washington relations because of this free trade agreement deal with China. I mean, obviously, the U.S. and China are trying to sort of are in a race or in a competition to stay relevant in this region. And some people are saying that Seoul is sort of stuck even in the trade policy. Is this true? How do you assess the status quo?
Korea is a nice trading nation, but still small open economy. What can we do? We have to pursue all the possible options to extend our export market, and also we want to induce more FDI. So Korea-China FTA is not a FTA overnight. We do that since we try to discuss this since 2005, and we have 7 years of preparation, and even including 2 years of government consultation. So I think we have been doing this for a long, long time, and the negotiation itself took 30 months, 2.5 years, much longer than Korea-US or Korea-EU FTA. So this is a choice we want to maximize. I mean, it's not either this or that. So I don't think we are really asked to take this part or that part. I think we are doing it at the same time.
Okay.
First of all, I don't think that we should be faced with a choice between China and the United States in this kind of free trade agreements. Well, it's not a quite rational interpretation of what's happening in the world, in this globalized world. Just pitting some country against the other because they are playing the leading role in some group of trade negotiations. I cannot agree to that. We are open, and as Professor Park said, that Korea has an immense interest in joining these mega FTAs. Whoever may lead in any kind of this mega FTA.
Well, with that said, though, Chairman Han, South Korea is in the RCEP talks negotiation framework, but it's not in the TPP ones. So what's the thinking here?
Definitely Korean businesses would like to join TPP. If Japan is in and Korea is out, the result is, I think, devastating to Korean businesses. Although we have bilateral FTAs with 10 member countries of 12 now negotiating members of TPP, if they are forming one mega FTAs with TPP and Korea is out, most of the Korea supplying parts and components and materials, which amounts to $2 trillion and $200 billion within 12 countries of TPP, will mostly taken up by Japan.
As Chairman Han says, if TPP is concluded with the current 12 members, sooner or later, TPP should open its membership, because these 12 countries doesn't include most dynamic part of the world, most dynamic economies in the world, like Indonesia or or China or even Philippines. So to make a larger pie, they have to include some other members. For that, I think we already show our interest, already started our consultation. So it's not going to be very easy, but we should try to get into the TPP once they open up new participants.
My next question is, how do you forecast the three-way free trade agreement and negotiations between South Korea, Japan, and China will play out? Because I ask you this because Japan is part of the TPP negotiations, and Korea seems to be focusing on that with China and Japan in order to get closer to the TPP framework. Is that the right reading, or not necessarily?
I don't think
so?
the problem is whether we are close to TPP or we are closer to Korea, Japan, China. But it's clear that Korea focused more on Korea, China, while Japan focused more on TPP. So there is no actual linkage of momentum for Korea or Japan to focus on Korea, China, Japan. And also because of some non-economic problems of including history and others, these three countries were a little bit in a positions not to accelerate these three-country trilateral FTAs. But it's clear that we should do this, and Korea will be the country who will benefit most from Korea, China, Japan FTAs.
All right, and let's get that perspective in our video interview. We are getting one more voice on this topic of multilateral free trade pacts. Meet Deborah Elms, Executive Director of the Asian Trade Center.
So Korea has two negotiations, one that it's participating in, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, and one that it's not participating in yet, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. In RCEP, Korea should really push as hard as it can to have the highest quality result. That is not easy to do because many of the other 16 parties in RCEP are less enthusiastic about trade and trade openness, but a better higher quality agreement will benefit Korea significantly and Korean companies a lot. The second thing, which I know is a very important objective for the Korean government, is to get Korea into the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks, the TPP, as rapidly as possible. Of the two agreements, although many people will argue that RCEP will give Korean companies more benefits, I don't think so. I think TPP is more important for Korea because the agreement itself is broader, it's deeper, it covers a lot more areas, and it will expand in the future. Well, I think that Korea has an interesting bridging role to play because you have a bit of an issue in the WTO in particular with not a lot of voices coming in favor of multilateral efforts, particularly from players that are not necessarily the big players. In other words, not the US, not the EU, but also not China, not India. It's sort of a ripe space, I think, for countries like Korea to play a very constructive role in trying to explain why the multilateral system matters, why especially it brings benefits to smaller and poorer countries. And if we don't have more governments championing the movement at the multilateral system, then we will never see progress at the global system.
All right, so a lot of expectations for Korea in this free trade agreement environment. Now, it is certainly expected to enter more into more free trade agreements down the road, and multilateral ones, bilateral ones. And I feel like it seems like the role of trade experts like you and you, but we don't have, so what do you think is needed to foster quality free trade agreements for Korea and quality trade experts like yourselves?
We now have Ministry of Trade and Industry,
right,
now which has the now Trade Negotiation Bureau. And I think some senior officials, they have accumulated large experiences because we have so far had many FTA negotiations. Right. But for a little bit younger and junior officials, I think we have to give them more opportunities we have to send them to some special organization or WTO or whatever, so that make them diversify their experiences, including knowledge of trade law and intellectual property rights, including language skills. I think that this is one way we should promote definitely. Another thing is we have to also utilize experts outside the government.
Okay.
I think that trade or law cannot solve the problems. There are some trade experts, but I think they should have some experience at academia, or they should have some experience by policy making themselves. That experience is very, very important.
Now, as we are wrapping up today's discussion on Korea's trade policy, Korea started off with its free trade agreements more like playing defense in the beginning. But now it's, pursuing quite an ambitious trade policy and, dreaming of becoming the regional trade hub. So what would be your word of advice for Korea, future governments, as well as future trade experts? So maybe I'll start off with you.
Well, I don't want to go back to the very old, period like 1960s or 70s, but still, the leaders, attention to this area is very, very important. Otherwise, we make a policy, lots of policy programs, but it's very slow to implement. We have to check them whether this is being effectively implemented, and also it become much more transparent to foreign trading partners or even foreign companies. So for all kind of aspects regarding the international trade and foreign investment, I think leaders and ministers, even president, they should pay more attention to what's going on, how our policies are effectively implemented or not.
Korea's developments during the last 60 years was only possible because of our adoption of open economic policy. So we should have a clear conviction in that paradigm. So our GDP now is 1.3 trillion US dollars. Outside the world, the GDP is $74 trillion. So it's so natural that we should go abroad and do our marketing, and we should sell and buy and invest and attract investments from abroad. So we should have a clear conviction in that. So whatever kind of FTAs are emerging, if it is more multilateral, there's a real urgency for us to be in rather than out. If we are out, our bilateral FTAs will lose their effects quite rapidly. So we should involve in that. The second point is that our FTA should take the frame of being more inclusive. That means there should be more people who can benefit from them. We said small and medium-sized companies and farmers and the general public. With our trade policy being more inclusive and sustainable, we can implement our firm conviction that we should participate in this trade liberalization initiative. And through that, we can improve our economy, increase our employments, and we can improve our balance of payments.
All right, gotta leave it there, but I'm gonna ask you, both of you, to play your roles for that kind of vision to come true. Thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cherry.
All right, and thank you for watching as well. Do join us again next time, and until then, stay with us online and on Twitter. Bye-bye.